This video will be a biomechanical analysis of an overhand softball throw. The van is just to show the progress I have made thus far and to add a good intro clip. So this is a throw before any instruction. As you can see, there's very little rotation to the ball and it is not thrown very hard. This is three-time gold medalist Leo Bryan. So in the wind-up phase, you see very little flexion in the front knee, whereas with Leo Bryan, you see a greater degree of flexion in that front knee. So as we enter the stride phase, we see very little abduction of the hips. This puts her in a very poor position to rotate, and that means there's not going to be an adequate transferring of the ground reaction force into the ball. Whereas when we see with Leo Bryan, we see a lot of abduction of the hips, a driving of the back knee in order to prepare her for the transfer of energy into her upper extremities. As we enter the cocking phase, we can see there's not a very powerful leg drive by that back leg. And so that means there's not going to be a very explosive rotation of the hips and the trunk of the body, and that puts a lot of stress on the upper extremity because there's not very much force being transferred. Here we see a very powerful leg drive by Leo Bryan, and that means that rotation is very powerful and transfer the energy into the shoulder to take the stress off. As we enter the acceleration phase, we know there's not a lot of ground reaction force that is transferred into the shoulder. This leaves the shoulder responsible for its acceleration and providing velocity to the ball. And from the release point, we can see the velocity is poor because the release point is higher. Here we see with Leo Bryan, we see the energy being transferred through the legs and the hips to the shoulder, and because the release point is lower, the velocity is much higher. As we enter the deceleration phase, we can tell from the lack of rotation in the hips and the neutral back and the short displacement of the arm that this was not a very hard throw. Whereas if we look at Leo Bryan, we can see a lot of flexion in the back and the hips, and we can see a long displacement of the arm, which means her throw had a much higher velocity on it than the other athletes. So following the first throws, we entered an instruction phase where I gave advice on how to improve her throw. As a previous softball instructor, I understand the importance of putting this in terms the athlete can understand to ultimately give success. And so I told the athlete to pull her left arm into her side to cause a bigger rotation, which affects all parts of the throw, from the lower body explosion to the deceleration. After instruction, we see a much larger rotation of the throw, much more similar to Leo Bryan's. So we enter the wind-up phase again, and we see more flexion in the knee. However, I feel this is up to the individual and the timing of her own throw. But we can see that there's definitely a close resemblance to Leo Bryan's throw, or Leo Bryan's wind-up phase, and her flexion in her knee. So as we enter the stride phase again, we see there's a lot more abduction of the hips, and we can see that right knee starting to drive forward into the rotation of the throw. And you can see that she's in a much more powerful position here than she was in her first throws. The stance is much more similar to Leo Bryan's in the abduction of the hip and the driving of that back knee. So as we enter the cocking phase, we can see there's much more rotation starting to happen here than in the first throws, and we can see that she is pulling down much harder with her left elbow, which stimulates this driving of the legs. It's much more similar here than it was in the first throw to Leo Bryan's throw, and you can see the rotation is very similar in how they look during this phase. So we enter the acceleration phase. You can see there's much more rotation in the hips and that the back knee is in flexion, driving forward into a stable knee, also in slight flexion. And you can tell that the release point is a lot lower, so the acceleration is more. It's much more similar to Leo Bryan's here, with that stable front knee and that back knee driving forward, and the release points are pretty close to the same spot. So as we enter the deceleration phase, we can see a larger rotation in the hips, more flexion in the back, and a larger displacement of the arm, which means this throw had a much higher velocity than her first throws. This position is very similar to how Leo Bryan looks, with the flexion of the back, the rotation of the knees, and the long displacement of the arm. So to end the video, I wanted to compare the throws back to back. So first we see very little abduction in the hips, which causes a very poor leg drive in the back, which is not a lot of rotation. And the lack of force from pulling down with that left arm does not help with the lack of rotation, and this causes a lot of stress on the shoulder when she throws, because there's no power coming from anywhere but her right shoulder in this throw. So her release point is very high and the velocity was very poor. So then we go here and we see a larger abduction of the hips, a more powerful pull down of the left arm, more leg drive forward, and a bigger rotation and a long displacement of the deceleration phase.